Imagine winning a war against the most powerful empire on Earth, then becoming the most powerful man in your new country, and having thousands of armed, unpaid soldiers begging you to march on your own government and take the throne. At that moment, George Washington had something almost no man in history had ever been offered: the chance to become a king. As the story is often told, when King George III of England was asked what Washington would do after winning the war, he was told Washington planned to give up all his power and go back to his farm. The king is said to have replied that if Washington actually did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. This is the story of how a young man who failed catastrophically in his first war. He became the only man in history to turn down a crown. Meanwhile, most people won't even turn down free refills. George Washington was not born a war hero. He wasn't born into royalty either. He was born February 22, 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, into a wealthy but not especially powerful planter family. When he was 11, his father died, and the family's future changed overnight.
Washington never went to college. Instead, he learned mathematics, surveying, and land management, practical skills for a boy who had to grow up fast.
At 17, he became a surveyor, working the dangerous Virginia frontier. The wilderness taught him something no classroom could: how to survive when everything goes wrong. Soon, everything did. In 1754, a 22-year-old Washington led a small force. This ignited a conflict that would explode into a global war. Surrounded at a crude position called Fort Necessity, exhausted and out of supplies, Washington did the unthinkable. It was not his finest hour. He surrendered. But to be fair, the fort was basically a large fence. Think about that. The future father of his country lost his very first battle. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't destined for greatness. He was a self-taught surveyor who had just made a devastating mistake. The wilderness taught him one lethal lesson: don't trust your instincts. Most of the time, they are wrong. In war, you don't have to be brilliant every day. You just have to survive to fight the next one. That lesson would save a revolution. Fast forward 20 years. Tensions between Britain and its colonies had exploded over taxes, control, and representation. And open war had begun. 1775. Congress handed Washington command. He accepted command of the Continental Army. By the winter of 1776, the revolution was on the brink of collapse. New York had fallen. Washington's army was retreating through the freezing cold. Soldiers were deserting by the dozens. And frankly, who could blame them? It was dynamic. Here's what most people miss. Washington wasn't just fighting the British. He was fighting a clock. Most of his soldiers' enlistment contracts expired on December 31st. In less than a week, his entire army would be legally free to walk home. If he waited for spring, there might be no army left to command. So on Christmas night, through floating ice and freezing darkness, Washington crossed the Delaware River for a desperate surprise attack on Trenton. At dawn, he struck. And against every expectation, the Americans won. By the winter of 1776, the revolution was on the brink of collapse. New York had fallen. New York had fallen. It was a race against time, dissolving in 6 days, and it gave America something it desperately needed: hope. hope. Let's look at Washington. But while Washington was fighting the British, a very different battle was quietly building behind the scenes. After Trenton, Washington understood something that terrified his own generals. America could not beat Britain in open, head-on battle. So he did something his critics called cowardice. He ran. He retreated, delayed, ambushed, and preserved his army. Washington was a smart man. He knew when to fight and when to run.
Let me at him!
No, we are going this way. We live to fight another day. Washington was a smart man. He knew when to fight and when to run.
Let me at him!
No, we are going this way. We live to fight another day. He realized he didn't need to destroy the British army. He just needed to keep the American army alive. Also, running away is technically a strategy. Long enough for Britain to grow tired of paying for a war 3,000 miles from home. His greatest weapon wasn't his sword. It was his patience.
And a lot of sand.
That patience would be tested one final time, not by the British, but by his own men. By 1783, Britain had surrendered. America had won. That is exactly when the real danger began. Furious, Washington's own officers gathered at Newburgh, New York, and began plotting. We must take what is owed to us. If Congress will not hear us, we advance. They had the guns. They had the men. They were ready to march on Congress. They were ready to march on Congress, overthrow the fragile civilian government, and hand Washington the one thing no American had ever held: absolute power. Which, to be fair, George Washington actively turned down. King George III literally could not comprehend it. History had seen this story before. Julius Caesar took it. Oliver Cromwell took it. In 1783, the army was furious. Washington walked into a room full of armed, angry men ready to crown him. And by crown, I mean violently overthrow the government. No pressure at all, George. He didn't draw a weapon. He pulled out a letter from Congress, tried to read it, and faltered. Washington was at his wit's end, so he did something no one expected. Then he reached into his pocket for something his men had never once seen him wear: a pair of spectacles. He told them softly that he had grown gray in their service, and now found himself growing blind. Strong men wept. The mutiny collapsed on the spot. Nothing beats a guilt trip from George Washington. Days later, Washington did the unthinkable. He handed his sword back to Congress and walked away, a private citizen again. But his greatest test wasn't behind him. It was still coming. Before that test arrived, there is a part of this story that cannot be skipped. It is a tale of absolute, unavoidable chaos. The man who risked his life fighting political tyranny returned home to Mount Vernon to be served by enslaved human beings. The man who risked his life fighting political tyranny returned home to Mount Vernon to be served by enslaved human beings. While he spent 8 years fighting for liberty on the battlefield, hundreds of men, women, and children under his control were denied the most basic freedoms of their own. In his later years, Washington's private views on slavery shifted. In his will, he arranged for the enslaved people he directly owned to be freed after his wife's death. It does not erase the contradiction. The man who helped found a nation built on liberty was, at the very same time, a slaveholder. That paradox followed his name long after he was gone. And it belongs in his story, not beside it. In 1789, America elected its first president. There were no term limits, no precedent, no rule book, Washington could have stayed in power until the day he died, quietly turning the presidency into a monarchy, wearing a different name. Instead, after 2 terms, he stepped down voluntarily in 1797. A concept some future leaders found hard to grasp. Welcome back to our look at American history. And this is where the story returns to where it began. Throughout history, power has been taken by force and held until death. Emperors, conquerors, dictators. They were all willing to sacrifice everything just to keep a throne one more day. As the story goes, when King George III heard that the man who had defeated his empire had willingly given up power for a second time, just to retire to a farm, he is said to have spoken the words that had once been a prediction and were now simply true. He is the greatest man in the world. George Washington died at Mount Vernon on December 14, 1799. He was 67, a remarkably ripe old age for a time when medicine... By George, he was a massive legend. But by then, the country had already stopped seeing him as just a man. Stories about his honesty and character spread across the young nation. Some true, some invented, like that giant cherry tree he supposedly chopped down. Like the famous cherry tree tale, written years after his death and believed by generations anyway. America wasn't just remembering Washington, it was building a symbol out of pure myth and some very heavy stone, and a lot of wishful thinking. The real man was more complicated than the symbol. Ambitious, wealthy, a slaveholder, a revolutionary, a politician. Turns out, founding fathers and twice, a man who held ultimate power in his hands chose to put it down. He chose to put it down. That choice became something more permanent than any throne. It became a precedent, the idea that a leader could hold enormous power and still hand it back. That choice became something more permanent than any throne. It became a precedent, the idea that a leader could hold enormous power and still hand it back. Because Washington's greatest victory was never really about defeating an empire. It was proving, to a world built on kings, that the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who takes the crown. It's the one who has the chance to take it and walks away instead.
If you want to see what every president did with power, subscribe, because the next one gets even stranger.